N-O-S-T, Nost, A-G-A-I-N, again,
Nostagain.
So, hello everybody. Hi. If you want to say hi, write something in the chat so we know it works. Yes, if folks can do that. My name is Richie. Welcome to season 2, episode 4. Hi, season 2, episode 4 of our web series, memorabilia.mp4. We're really happy to have you here. This is our last episode of the year. And just as a little introduction, memorabilia.mp4 is part of a larger group called the Nostagain Network. That's right, best for last, Kenna. We are North America's largest student-led collective that explores, studies, and showcases work that engages with nostalgia. What an elusive concept. So the Nostagain network can be found on many platforms. On LinkedIn as the Nostagain Network, or Blue Sky as well in the same name, and especially where we're most active on our Instagram at Nostagain. So you can find recordings of Jess's talk as well as all of our other network events there.
So yeah, before we get into the topic of today, I'd like to give a territorial acknowledgement. At the Nostagain Network, we recognize the traditional territories upon which each participant works and/or lives, either as invited or uninvited guests, and the Nostagain Network is committed to honoring and enacting respect and ethics in the work we do on all traditional and ancestral lands.
And so now we are on our second season, and Jess is our 8th presenter, so lucky 8. Memorabilia has featured many, many people. So architects, hello today. A game maker who has over 10,000 wish lists on Instagram for an unreleased nostalgia game. We had VR artists, we had journalists, we had filmmakers, all kinds of people everywhere who explore what we call at Nostagain generative nostalgia. And what we mean by generative nostalgia at Nostagain is instead of looking at nostalgia as something based in the past to look back, something regressive, right, or lonesome, we want to understand how people draw on their nostalgias, what matters to them then, and how they can use it to improve the now and perhaps as a blueprint for the future. So nostalgia is turned around as something that can generate action, critiques, and insights rather than just about the past.
And related to that, we are so fortunate today to speak with Jessica Villarasa, an architect exploring ideas about culture, change, and adaptable housing through their master's thesis project titled KASAMA, which is Filipino for together or with. And it turns to memory as a source of design knowledge. So rooted in Jessica's upbringing in a Filipino-Italian fiveplex in Saint-Leonard, where rooms morphed and care flowed across units, the project uses drawings, interviews, and archival storytelling to trace how immigrant families remake home.
Jessica Villarasa is a Montreal-born architectural designer and Master of Architecture candidate at McGill University. She has spent nearly 8 years working at a small architecture firm designing housing across scales, from single-family homes to multi-building projects. Her work bridges professional practice and research, focusing on how everyday life and care shape the spaces we inhabit.
So today, we are your moderators. My name is Derek Pasborg. I have a Master of Arts in Sociology. I'm joined by my colleague. Oh, Richie, sorry, you were muted, so. Richie is a PhD candidate in social and cultural analysis. And Zoe.
And I'm Zoe. I am a BFA student in design and art history.
And we
Very
all come
excited
to you. Sorry, Zoe. We all come to you from Concordia University, in and around it, in Montreal. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that if you have any questions at all throughout the talk, just above you, right below the actual border of the window, there's a Q&A section, and if you have any questions, please post them there, and we'll get to you when we get to our actual Q&A section. Jess, it is our absolute pleasure to pass it on over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
share my screen. So yeah, hi everyone. My name is Jessica. So I've spent the last 8 years working on housing in Montreal, and so I'm spending the next year working on this directed research project called KASAMA, and it begins with a simple question of how do immigrant families in Montreal actually adapt their homes over time, and what can that teach us about designing future housing? So instead of starting from a blank slate, I turned back to my old family, my own family, and the building that I grew up in, which is the photo that you see on the screen right now. So starting off, I want to begin the story of my roots. And so this is a town called Calatrava, which is a small coastal town in the Philippines that my family's from. And so my great grandmother was a single mother of 11, and she ran the town's store and fishery. And with every extra peso that she made, she bought land. So this is kind of a little um, a little excerpt of some of the land that's divided amongst the siblings here. And so over time, she accumulated such a large stretch of coconut and rice fields that she passed on to her children. So for my family, land became a guarantee that everyone has somewhere to return to and something to inherit. So home is proximity, it's continuity, it's the shared responsibility, and that ethic kind of sits underneath everything else I'm going to show you. So an example of that pattern begins in this compound, which belongs to my great aunt, so my grandmother's sister, and this is her land in Palawan. So it's not in our hometown, but in another region of the Philippines. And on one piece of land, she has her house in the middle. So this is just kind of a sketch of the cluster of homes you see in the back. So this is her home in the middle. And then she has a house for her son, another one for her daughter, another one for her niece and nephew. And then on top of that, there is a building with 6 rental units, which is owned by another one of her daughters. And then there's a small restaurant that's being rented along the site's edge here. So in this compound, the daily life revolves around an outdoor dining area, which you see over here. And that's where everyone shares meals, no matter which house that they sleep in. So people live in separate houses, but it's still very much a shared life. So these family compounds kind of become a frame of reference for what home means like to us. And like it's all about staying close and having overlapping households, and how does the built form kind of stretch to accommodate that care. So moving on to the fiveplex back in Montreal, where my grandmother carried that logic into a very ordinary building, which is this fiveplex in Saint-Leonard. And before I explain further, I'd like to show a digital story that I made as a first step to this project, kind of telling a little bit of my grandmother's story, and then transitioning into the story of the fiveplex that inspired this project to begin with.
Sorry, Jess, you need to share with sound and not hearing anything.
1 second, sorry.
It's okay, it's okay.
Okay, I think I did that properly.
All good.
This is my grandmother, Norma Falqueza. She came from the Philippines in the 1960s for an adventure, working as a nurse in every province until she decided to settle in Montreal. She could have gone to hospitals like the Royal Vic or St. Mary's, but Santa Gabrini in the east said yes first. That small choice fixed us in St. Leonard, among the Italians with their gardens, grocery stores, churches, and duplexes. Those surroundings shaped how my family built home here. This is the fiveplex that my grandmother bought in Saint-Leonard. It unexpectedly became our intergenerational anchor, where different family members moved in and out and in between apartments, depending on need.
And it all starts with the architecture of this fiveplex.
This was her pride and joy. Like, that my mom would wake up early in the morning, and those are the little things that I miss the most. Is that walis ting ting that you hear? Hercules sweeping the garden. So don't forget, the first 8 years was just you and Kuya. We were a family of 4, but we just made it work. It's funny that we don't think of it was hard, but we just dealt with it because this is our reality. The Lola JD would be the highlight of the story because she's the one who took care of the kids while they were growing up.
Yeah, that was a fun time. I remember that's when we had Bell's satellite TV, and it was only in the living room. So yeah, it gave us a reason to, bring the beds in the living room.
My mother was living downstairs. Auntie Kim was living downstairs. The major help in this was because my mom would come up sometimes and start folding the clothes.
Yeah.
She would do the laundry.
The smaller it is, the more compact it is.
I did feel crammed, and it was all I knew, so crammed felt normal to me.
Because for us, it's like there weren't ever really boundaries, I guess, because space was all of ours. It was always shared. When we were sharing that bathroom, and if you really had to go, you would just go to Lola's. That's like kind of a benefit of having family also in the building.
For my time living in apartment 2, while I had my own apartment for the first time, I had my own space, and then Patrick moved in for a bit. That was my first experience with a roommate. And then all of a sudden, I have a girlfriend, and she moves in, and I barely even know her. We also shared a lot of things that my family needed access to. So a lot of, I guess, boundaries that were tested.
So this fiveplex has so much history. A lot of emotion is in there. It's emotion of learn about the history of this place and when it was built. This is backyard to backyard. Everyone knows each other. Everyone is just going like this with their coffee in front of each other, contesting about how their tomato is better than the other.
The fiveplex was never static. People moved between units. Care flowed across floors. Proximity is what made this possible. What my grandmother bought as a building became an adaptable system of family, culture, and survival. These everyday adaptations are what my project asks. What if housing was designed to hold culture, care, and change?
Okay, so going back to my grandmother's story, I think what stays with me now, especially as I work on this project, is how deliberate her choices were. So she didn't drive. So she bought a building in a neighborhood that she could walk or take transit to the hospital, to church, to groceries, and for her kids to walk to school and eventually her grandkids. So following what she learned from her own mother, she bought plexes whenever she could. She would always buy property, one of them being the fiveplex. So the plex is part of a bigger Montreal story. So it's a typical Montreal typology where there's a stacked set of flats on a single lot, and there's usually a shared stair, whether it's outside or inside. And it's often described as a malleable unit because it can hold very different household configurations inside a simple structure. So in Saint-Leonard, the neighborhood that I grew up, it was a major Italian neighborhood in the 60s and 70s. And so Italian families bought or built plexes, and one family would live on one floor and they would rent out the others, and gradually modified the buildings with Italian cultural motifs. So you can see there's a lot of arches, detailed ironwork, stone, and lion statues, and they would always have cantinas in the basement too. So they kind of morphed the plex as like a cultural adaptation. So for our building, it was built in 1970, but my grandmother bought it in the 80s, and she was one of the few women of color owning property on that block at the time. So architecturally, it's very simple and repetitive. The units are connected by the common stair. And by making these 6 plates that you saw in the video, I wanted to kind of visualize the building as a lived research site to show the social malleability of it and how it absorbed different constellations of family and tenants and care over time. But I wanted to focus on 2 plates in particular because it kind of went fast in the video. So in 2017 to 2019, I feel like in this era it was like a big change. So we grew up in apartment 4, but then this was the time that my brother and I got our own apartments. So it was our first moment of independence as adults, but we were still very much tied to apartment 4, so we would still come up for meals and we would share household items. So my mom would have the overflow of groceries either in my brother's apartment or my apartment or in the garage. Um, so we're kind of spread out across the whole building. And then in 2021, it was a bit different because my brother moved out and then I moved to Ottawa for my undergrad. So then I would kind of squat in one apartment when I would visit over the weekend. And then my mom had moved into another apartment. And it was better for her because she had more space to care for my grandmother at the time who needed full-time care. And I had my cousin who I sublet in my apartment too. Um, so yeah, moving into a more of a closer scale, I think of these next drawings as spatial ethnographies of home. So starting with this drawing, I wanted to map out the care networks that would happen between the building. And so this kind of traces the meals, childcare, elder care, and the small acts of support and like sharing chores that would happen throughout the building. And the main interfaces where this would happen are really ordinary things. It's the balcony, it's the shared stair, it's the garage, it's the backyard, and things like that. So it shows the building behaving less like individual units, but more like an ecosystem. The next few drawings I call the elastic living room. So it depicts my living room in apartment 4 through 4 distinct eras through time. So this is just a photo of my cousins and I. We're eating like nachos off my younger brother's picnic table in the living room, and we're all like cramped in the living room. And then this was another time when the living room turned into a gym. So I kind of reproduced what the living room looked like in plan through these different eras. So, and a lot of these were taken from old photographs that I found or old home videos because my parents would always film videos when we were kids. So, in 1999, it's kind of like my parents are still young adults, young parents. So there was like a stereo system and speakers because my dad was in a band. And there was this big curved bar in the living room. But then now there's a baby car seat and then a playpen dropped in the middle. And it's kind of that overlap of like, oh, we're still young and social. But then we suddenly have 2 kids compressed in one space. Oh, sorry. And then on the right, it's what I call the sleepover era. So like my brother and I would drag our bunk bed mattresses into the living room, like you saw in the video, to watch Bell Satellite TV. So at night, it would become like a dorm, and then our cousins would come over to sleep over too. And a lot of times we would actually sleep here more than our actual bedroom because there was just more stuff to do in the living room. And then in 2011, we're now 5 people in the apartment. So my younger brother was born. And it's in the same room where there's a gym and then the playroom. So there's my brother's toys everywhere. I'm doing homework, people are hanging out, and this is all happening in one space. And then in 2017, my grandmother moves in and she needs more full-time care. So she's sleeping in the middle of the living room, so she's always visible and close to help. But you could still see traces of my siblings and I coming for food or coming to hang out. But yeah, it's very much still centered on the elder care. So when I overlay all of these four eras, you get this mess of lines. And to me, this is what memory looks like in plan. And we remember by layering all of these different uses of the room on top of each other. So architecturally, nothing changes, same four walls, but socially, like the room keeps getting negotiated over and over. And that's why I call it the elastic living room. So the next few drawings talks about the kitchen. And so this drawing was a fun little drawing as an interface between the two food worlds. So in blue are Italian groceries from local stores in Saint-Leonard. So you have your San Marzano tomatoes, pasta, cold cuts, and cheeses, which are all of these like local stores are close enough to be routine, and we mostly shop there. And then in red are Filipino staples that usually come from farther away and require a planned trip. So they arrive in batches. So there's like sinigang mix, different sauces, stuff like that. And then there's the shared ingredients where the cuisines overlap as well and different kitchen tools. Um, so yeah, a very ordinary kitchen becomes a place where these uneven proximities can get mixed into something that's very much normal to us. So I wanted to kind of document the overlap of all of these things. So I started with the base plan of my mom's apartment right now and kind of drawing all of the little objects that are always there and always present. Um, and then the first thing is rice as daily infrastructure. So there's always literally a pot of rice on the stove, and it's a persistent object in this kitchen because we also never had a rice cooker because partly because of space, but partly because of my mom insisted that we learn to cook rice properly in a pot so we can feed ourselves if we don't have a rice cooker. So yeah, and so this drawing kind of documents like the different actions and also the smell of rice um, going through the apartment. This layer I call neutral baon. So baon in Filipino is your lunch that you bring to school or work. And so growing up in an Italian neighborhood, most of my friends brought simple cold cuts, paninis to school. And so I started doing the same, not because I didn't like Filipino food, but because the panini doesn't have a smell, so it doesn't invite questions. So it's kind of the opposite of the stinky lunch stigma that many immigrant kids have to deal with. But at the same time, my mom also grew up here, so she genuinely loves cold cuts, and she grew up with the same deli, so it's genuinely a part of our kitchen. And this layer, um, I call hybrid sauce because it's my mom's meat sauce, and she makes a very Italian seeming sauce with good tomatoes and good herbs because those are easy to get nearby, but it still leans toward Filipino tastes because she still adds a bit of sugar. So it's kind of a toned down version of Filipino spaghetti, which everyone knows is very, very sweet. Um, so inside this one pot, you kind of get a small negotiation between the Italian proximity and the Filipino culture. And then this I call when smell becomes architecture. So it tracks the strong smelling foods, which is fried fish. Um, And for us, that smell kind of means home and comfort, but it sticks to all of your clothes, and if you leave your bedroom door open, your whole room is going to smell like fried fish. So it kind of becomes a quiet architecture because it kind of determines which windows to open, when to fry, which doors to close, and things like that. So even if you have a little bit of your door open, it'll still seep through. And then this I call baon circulation. So it's the movement of Tupperwares and plates between floors. So I live downstairs, so I'll often go up to my mom's to get food and bring it back down. But a lot of times I would still come eat upstairs. And my brother doesn't live at home anymore, but he always leaves with a container of leftovers every time he visits. So I see the staircase as kind of this informal food corridor. Um, so now layering all of these traces, you can see that the kitchen carries a lot of cultural memory. It manages stigma around smell, and it stitches people together who don't technically live in the same unit anymore. Okay, so why this matters now, I want to zoom out for a moment and say why I think this matters beyond this fiveplex. So this project is happening in the middle of a serious housing crisis in Canada. The rents are rising and there's simply not enough housing supply, and this diagram kind of shows that. And a lot of people are doubling up or living across generations just to make things work, not only because they want to, but because they have to. And most of the new housing that I work on in practice is still based on a pretty rigid model of the nuclear family and a standardized unit. So in that world, housing is very much treated like a product, and we have to maximize units all the time, maximize the rentable area, and squeeze every possible square inch out of a site. So when I set that logic next to what I know and I'm learning from the fiveplex, you realize that the way people actually live doesn't fit neatly into what we keep designing. Um, so yeah, so my project is my attempt to use nostalgia and memory to push back and think about what housing we can design if we started from these lived practices. And a few takeaways that I've been thinking about. So like I eventually plan on designing my own housing project next semester because it's a year-long project. So this is just the research phase, but some takeaways are that adaptability is social and temporal before it is technical. So, how the living room changed over and over, and how sleep is also not confined to the bedroom and things like that. Um, Everyday care is the real infrastructure. So, the flows that matter the most are food and favors, chores, and childcare that moves between the building. And architecture can either make those flows easy or block them. Um, and food, smell, and storage are central. So thinking of the kitchen as kind of a social condenser, where everyone can come and they're always free to come and eat and talk and take food. Thinking about storage in a kitchen because most of the projects I work on, we only provide like a 2 foot wide pantry, which is not really enough for a family. Um, so yeah, and then so for me, that this project is kind of what generative nostalgia is. It's kind of taking our memories of home um, seriously enough so that they start to change how we design. And I know my family's story is not the only example. Like there's so many other houses and apartments that quietly do this work. So yeah, if any of this felt familiar to you, um, or if you know of any stories of like similar patterns, I'd really love to hear them. So feel free to reach out to me because I would love to get people's stories and integrate them into my project. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. That's it.
Jess, that was amazing. Like I'm kind of at a loss for words here. I didn't know what we were quite getting into here, but this is awesome. You can't lift the lid, lift the roof off the house, and like we want to be in there. We want let's get into this. This is awesome. I don't know if Richie, do you want to go ahead? I feel like you got a lot of stuff on your mind that you wanna get out. I'll let you go ahead. Go for it.
Thanks, Derek. I'm about to explode. Holy crap. Jess, thank you. I grew up in a Thai household. I'm from Thailand, so everything you say, you making me homesick. Food, absolutely the central point. I'll ask my question. And folks, as you're thinking along as well, if you want to use the Q&A function above, we will read your comments at the end around at 45 or 50. So feel free for that. Jess, first and foremost, my goodness, I love the way how seamlessly you bring in design practices with your own experiences, but you've never let go the sight that this comes from your family, right? Like it's so beautiful how Lola Norma, right, was taught that buying land, and you had this beautiful quote that was buying land guarantees that everyone has somewhere to return to, right? And then your mother was teaching sort of how to cook rice, not only to survive, right, but also to make a home for yourself. A rice is daily infrastructure, as you say. So there's this sort of passing on, and you're doing in some ways the same way, Kasama, right? It's talking about what you've learned and how it can be helpful for people around. I was wondering though, just as something that caught my attention. You talk and stress a lot about the social practices that make a particular building or compound or complex home, right? If we think of nostalgia, there's that famous saying that home is where you make it. I am wondering, other than social infrastructure, the elasticity of it all, has there been a sort of change with the structure itself? So the building becoming dilapidated, the building becoming broken down, these things that the infrastructure does that you respond to as a family, instead of just the family making it work with social onto the building does something onto the family, a sort of little conversation between the people who live there and the structure that's being lived in. Just curious.
Honestly, the building hasn't really changed structurally at all over the past 30 years. Like maybe we've done renovations to the apartments, but we haven't really demolished any of the walls or any of that. But it was always a conversation between my parents, especially the fact that we lived on the top floor. And my parents always had this vision of, oh, why don't we just break down the wall in the kitchen and make this huge type of like U-shaped apartment. So we'd make an even bigger kitchen and then everyone could have their own bedroom. And I think that's what's the beauty of the plex itself, because it's built out of wood, so you can easily demolish walls compared to if it was built out of like concrete block. You know what I mean? And so that's what's nice about it is that if if life changes and if you wanted to tear down walls, you could. You can make your bedroom double the size if you wanted to. Um, but yeah, I think the main thing is that just like we've stayed within the walls that were already there, but it was mostly just the uses changing. Even the garage, like now that I'm thinking of the garage, we used to have a lot of house parties there. But then at one point during COVID, when the gyms were closed, like I made that my gym, my home gym. And then my brother would used to stream on Twitch. So he would stream DJ sets because he's a DJ. So he had this whole like setup in the garage, um, taking up space. And then now it's just storage. But yeah, it's kind of like even just that room itself has morphed a lot through time. Yeah.
That's something to think about, and I think related to this, I guess my question is, why do you think it's important to highlight the overlap between culture and nostalgia, in especially in like architecture and design? I'm curious if it's something that you already knew or had like a hunch for before you started the project, or is it something that kind of like was inspiring or surprising to you?
I think it was inspiring, especially like when we think about proximity and when I started thinking about the kitchen more and smells. And and then I realized I'm like, we're not, even though we're Filipino, we're not a truly Filipino household, especially because my mom was born in the same neighborhood as well. So a lot of um, the culture and from our neighborhood seeps into the building, and um, the kitchen is very important because I mean even recipes are spatial. It determines how you move through the kitchen, what appliances you have, like even just the fact that you have a big bag of rice, you need a space for that. You know what I mean? So like ingredients are a big thing in the kitchen. So when I'm thinking forward to next semester, I think what's important to me is focusing on the design of the kitchen. And like I mentioned briefly at the end, like I've been thinking of the kitchen as a social condenser, and especially in a place like Montreal, um, I think it would be super interesting to make the kitchen as more of a semi-public space, you know? So, and almost like a storefront, so people can look in and see what's going on, what are the domestic practices going on. And then with that, it's the share of food, share of culture. Um, yeah, people can see what's going on in the household a little bit because I think the kitchen, especially like I think that's something that I discovered in my drawings, that the kitchen being tucked in the back, um, all of us having to go through this long corridor just to get to the kitchen and like the smells that travel through that corridor. But what if the kitchen was in the front? You know, how would that change like the dynamics of the apartment type of thing? So yeah, I think culture and food are very much tied to space and architecture. Yeah.
Speaking of space, I was curious to know your interpretation of kind of this trend in new developments of a focus on single and double occupancy. Because your work focuses a lot about memory and the creation of memory. So how would you say that, these current architectural trends play into this?
What do you mean by single and double like two
So
households living in one?
like for new builds, 1 or 2 bedrooms,
Yeah.
so really focusing on like individual
Okay.
units within like a greater high rise, for example.
Um, like I think there's still definitely a place for that, but I think because there's so much of that, and that is the norm nowadays, I
Yeah.
think what I'm going to design next semester is kind of going to challenge that a little bit. So I've been looking at other housing projects around the world that are co-housing, um, or buildings that are housing, but they're it's very much a participatory design process. So um, the the tenants of the building have a direct say in the layout, for example. Where do they want the kitchen? Do they want the kitchen and the dining room to be side by side or all open or separate? Or where do they want the living space type of thing? So, and then if you look at the floor plans of some of these projects, you see that every unit is completely different in its configuration. And I think that's really interesting because it kind of it reflects like what's important to that family. You know, do they want the living room to be more public or more private or things like that? Where do they want the bedrooms, you know, type of thing? And I think that's nice. And I think that's something that my advisor and I were talking about, is making this a participatory process and making and doing like a design workshop to see how people would design their own unit in this case. Instead of making these standardized units, which in a lot of the projects that I work on, it's always typical. So we always repeat all the units on all the floors. And I don't think that really makes interesting architecture. You know, it's very, very much standardized. Like I said, there is a place for that, but I think I've seen so much of that that I want to do something different. Yeah.
And it's an incredible concept, even one just to do like participatory architectural design, because I feel like there's kind of this divorce between future occupants and designers of spaces, especially also when intersecting with like cultural contexts. There's kind of like this imposition of what designers want and envision a space to be like, but not much conversation on how it's going to be used. And seeing, like, while you were presenting, I was thinking of friends who had kind of similar setup of their family would be in, you know, a multiplex, and their children would have different units within the building. And that in itself is such like a beautiful way of living, but it's not something that has been, you know, really studied. It's something that has existed and a kind of come from an immigrant experience, but it's still something that's considered not, you know, out of the ordinary, as opposed to something that's really beautiful and celebrated.
Yeah, and I think that's what I realized when I first thought of the building, and I realized I'm like, yeah, like I think especially the fiveplex, I feel like is kind of unique because usually it's a duplex or a triplex, but the fact that there's five and like the way that we moved between so many apartments, like even I feel like I lived in at least four of them, four out of the five, you know. But I think I've pretty much slept in every single apartment, and I think that yeah, that's something I wanted to bring to life because I think it's something that I took for granted growing up, you know. Because I think we always dream about being in a big house and having our own room, but like my brother and I shared a room growing up, and I think when I was a teenager, especially, I always wanted my own privacy, and it was hard to get privacy because, like in the video, like I said, that space was all of ours. We always shared space, and so I think that's a big challenge here too. Like I don't want to glamorize the fact that like the living room was elastic. I mean, like there are obviously challenges and trade-offs that come with that. Privacy being the main one. So I think like getting my own room for the first time or getting my own apartment for the first time was like a big change in my life, especially coming from a two-bedroom apartment, and we were a family of five, you know. So I think when I look back, uh, like yeah, at the time it was kind of annoying, but it was kind of like beautiful now that I think of it, because I think it honestly made my family closer because we were always in each other's space, you know, and our doors were always open, and we always hear what everyone's doing, even though we're in our own micro universe. Like for example, like my brother and I sharing a room growing up, we had a bunk bed, but like the way that we would kind of split up the room was through posters. And this is something that I was talking to my brother about. And like, so on one wall, I would have my Disney Hannah Montana posters. So this is like my wall. And then the next wall was like his posters type of thing. So that's how like we determined like whose space was whose. Um, yeah. So it's kind of a fun thing. I think also I want to also draw the bedroom too, because like just like the living room, the bedroom also morphed a lot through time. Like it was my mom's office at one point, and um, like the way that we reconfigured the bedroom also, like as we grew up and had more stuff, especially as teenagers, was kind of unique. Like we had these loft beds. I don't know if you remember what those look like, but it's like when the desk is at the bottom and then there's the ladder and then the bed's on top. So everything, and that took up like 90% of the room. But it kind of gave us our own little space within that frame. You know what I mean? Um, so
I just
yeah.
want to follow up on that response, and thank you so much, Jess. And I also want to thank folks here who are Jess's family and friends for making this possible. Otherwise, we wouldn't talking about it. I'm just curious, by the way. Earlier, when you interviewed your brother, he said this fantastic line that he said, "I did feel crammed, but it was all I knew, so crammed felt normal." Right? And so when you put it in the context of sort of nowadays that housing has a best friend, these days that housing, there's a lot of issues with folks with too little space or cannot afford like a comfortable space, for example. Um, Nowadays, there are more sorts of these alternative structures, especially for people who may or may not settle in a place. So, for example, co-op homes, right, where
Mhm.
people can live together, or motels, or like these
Mhm.
little sort of shared spaces where expats or people who travel here temporarily can come. And most of them are probably like, it's a really big room with like a lot of bunk beds or shared spaces, and then there's activity zones, and it's very sort of rationalize, sort of this
Mm.
is where the movie room is, this is where you eat. And it's sort of very similar to the Western notion of how in a family room, right? The living room is the first thing you see when you enter. And that can be, back in the day, that's where the family was at with TV dinners. But now, it then became the dining room. You shouldn't eat in your room, you should eat with your family. The garden is like a social zone, but only when it's good to go out and you have friends over for the barbecue. So there's all these rules, right, that come with and without space. Whereas for you, the garage is constantly changed from gym to streaming, etc. I was just
Mhm.
wondering, as a designer, having lived through this adaptability of your home, do you have any sorts of like suggestions or thoughts about the kinds of homes that I was just talking about, the co-op homes or the homes for like
Mm.
expats or people who come by like temporary housing, and how to design them to make it feel much more closer, how to sort of make it more organic, that people who are abroad and want to make a short temporary home can feel much more at home with one another using design and the practices you've had. Just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that I'm definitely gonna dive into next semester, but I think my first thought is to have um little like micro zones where people can have like their own little space where they can be like maybe you still see them, but they're like semi hidden so they could feel like okay, like I feel comfortable here type of thing. Um and it just made me think of like recently how I had I recently hosted a Halloween party in my apartment, and then my friend was telling me like, oh, there's a whole psychology to a party, and I feel like people feel more comfortable when there are multiple enclosed zones because people can just find their room and find their like safe space versus like a huge open space where you see everything and everything is seen, you always feel seen. And so maybe that's the first idea, like thinking like of the living room as elastic, but maybe I mean this isn't a new thing, but having like these movable partitions that can segment the space temporarily. But you can always pull them away and make the space open again, but it just depends on what you need in that moment. So I think yeah, like privacy, like having the option for privacy is a big thing in making people feel comfortable in their home. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And not everybody has posters to carry around and stick them, right? If we can break bread, so we can break rooms too. Why not? We have a question from the audience, Killian. And this is the question. If, let's say, the family members end up one day surpassing the capacities of the fiveplex, would you rather build another one to create another legacy there, or expand the fiveplex that you already have? What an interesting question.
Oh,
Or have you
I
thought
haven't
about this with your family yet? Or was this brought up now?
actually no. Yeah, I never thought of it. Now that I'm looking at the facade, it would be great to add another floor to it if we're allowed. I'm not sure, but um, yeah. Like I think of these other, I don't know where this housing project is, but um, it was this housing where it was built all out of concrete, and um, they intentionally left the columns and the rebar exposed so that in the future they can just add more floors to it. I mean, obviously this probably wouldn't work in our climate, but I think of that. It's like, why don't we just keep adding floors to it as the family expands? You know what I mean? Um, yeah.
So you'll have stories with each other and literal stories to build on one another.
Yeah.
Sorry about the pun. Cheers. Cheers. If folks have any burning questions to ask Jess, you can put it in the chat now, or if you just scroll up, I think Derek had posted Jess's contact email, including
I'll repost
cheers,
that.
Derek, including her Instagram. Actually, Derek, I got it here. There you go, twice.
Oh,
So
there you go. Yeah.
I think we are really pretty happy with this, and seriously, Jess, and I want to say to everyone here who has made this possible, sustaining the fiveplex even before Montreal, Lola Norma's in the Philippines. Thank you so much. Like this is the sort of thing that when we as students who study nostalgia, you can only read so much in the books until you see it in action, and it changes the way you view and relate to this thing that you study. So thank you for those who make this still home today and you shared with us. So we really appreciate it. And I think Derek would like to just say a few words to close off.
Yeah, I mean, just adding on to like what Richie said, I think this is a really fantastic discussion. And not only that, I think somebody had mentioned it before, we saved the one of the best for last at the very least. Let's go with that. And as much as we'd love to continue it here, unfortunately we're out of time. But that being said, still want to thank you all for coming. And as we were kind of mentioning, and as I'm sure Jess would like, reach out to her. Absolutely. You're looking for participants to interview and that kind of deal, I'm sure. So
Yeah.
absolutely. If you have stories to share and more time to do so than what we'd have here, absolutely reach out to Jess. There's an email there, 2 Instagrams there. And if also you're curious about what we do here at Nostagain, I'm going to share the following QR code, which will lead us to our link tree, our socials, the website, our newsletters as well, that kind of deal. Other than that, thank you all so much for coming. I hope we see you in the next one. Until then, have a great day.
Thank you so much.
If Jess can just stay behind. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Oh, that was fantastic. Super good. Man, you make me miss home. Oh, man. Oh, man.